find out, won't we? Do-do-do. Yay. And good morning. Good morning and welcome to First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville. Good morning. My name... Y'all just are not going to quiet down. I'm glad we're so all friends here. This is great. It's hard when it's the minister that's talking. Good morning and welcome to First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville. My name is Jay Tiefenbrunn and I'm very pleased to be your Director of Music Ministries. I'd like to invite you to join in singing this morning with number 160, Far Too Long by Fear Divided. Hymn number 160 in the gray hymnal. Please rise in body or in spirit as you are so moved and join in the singing. Far too long by fear divided, we have settled with the sword quarrels which should be decided by real reconciling word. Now the nations are united through as yet in name alone, and the distant goal is sighted, which the prophet's souls have shown. May at last we cease from warring, barriers of the hate remove, and earth's riches freely sharing, found the dynasty of love. Our second song this morning, there's a typo in your order of service. Sorry about that. It's 131, Love Will Guide Us. Hymn number 131, Love Will Guide Us. Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot speak before thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love. Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night. And our final song this morning is number 146, Soon the Day Will Arrive. Hymn number 146. Soon the day will arrive when we will be together, and no longer will we live in fear. And the children will smile without wondering whether on that day thundercloud will Good morning. Please take a moment and greet your neighbors.
We light our flaming chalice to illuminate the world we seek. In the search for truth, may we be just. In the search for justice, may we be loving. And in loving, may we find peace.
And speaking of peace, I would love everybody to help me with this reading in the back of the Gray Hymnal, 602, boys and girls. I think you'd like this one. It's called If There Is to Be Peace. And I'll read the bold print, if you will, read the italic print. As we join our hearts and minds in the spirit of worship. If there is to be peace in the world, if there is to be peace in the nations, if there is to be peace in the cities, if there is to be peace between neighbors, if there is to be peace in the home, may it be so.
This
Well, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, in the land of Judea, which is where the Israelites lived under very harsh rule of a military government, the Romans. And they were afraid a lot, afraid of the violence, afraid of that they would be told they couldn't practice their religion. But not everybody was afraid. There was a man named Zechariah. He was married to Elizabeth, and they wanted to bring children into the world, but they hadn't been able to have children, and they were getting old, but they hadn't lost hope yet. They were still hoping. And one day, Zechariah, he worked at the Jewish temple, and he was there, and he was very surprised, and all of a sudden before him came something that did terrify him. It was a big angel, a messenger from heaven knows where, and it looked down at him, came out of nowhere, looked down at him, and you should have seen the look on Zechariah's face. He was like shaking. And the angel said, "Do not be afraid. I've come here to tell you some good news. My name is Gabriel, and you and Elizabeth are going to have a baby, and you're going to name him John." Told him what to name the kid, right? "And he's going to be a blessing to you and to all your people." Well, Zechariah was so afraid. I mean, he was happy, but he was afraid that he didn't say a word. He couldn't even tell Elizabeth that they were going to have a child, but she found out soon enough that she was going to have a baby. So they were very happy. And about 6 months later, down near the sea, so it wasn't too close, there was a young woman named Mary. And she was a cousin to Elizabeth, and she was not expecting to get pregnant at all because she wasn't married. And in those days, everybody had to be married when they had babies. But she was engaged to be married. Well, one day she was actually studying at the temple, and that same angel, but she didn't know anybody else had seen it, came before her out of nowhere. And she had that same look on her face. And the angel said the same thing. Do you remember what the angel said? "Be not afraid." And to take a deep breath. She still looked afraid. He said, "Take a deep breath. Just breathe. Calm down." And he said, "I've come to bring you good news. My name is Gabriel." And so it was the same angel even. Said, "You are going to have a baby." And all of a sudden she looked really scared again. Because she's like, "I can't have a baby." Says, No, it's all right. It's going to be good. It's going to be a blessing to you and to all your people. And anyway, Elizabeth is going to have a baby too, which was kind of nice to tell her because she packed up her bags immediately and went to visit Elizabeth. And there she hung out with Elizabeth for several months. Now, while she was kind of hiding out with Elizabeth and starting to see this baby grow in her, the rumors were going around that Mary was going to have a baby. And Joseph, her fiancé, the person she was going to marry, found out about this. And he got very afraid for a whole different reason. He got afraid because he knew people were going to go, "Joseph, if he married her, ha, 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 he's bad." And he would feel ashamed. So it says in the story, just because he was just a man, he was just a person, he was afraid of what other people thought. But that happens, doesn't it? We get afraid of what other people are going to think. So he had decided, and he felt good about this. He made a decision. I'm just going to quietly break the engagement, not make a big deal about it. No one really has to know. And everybody will just kind of forget about it and it'll go away. So he makes this decision. He feels really good and he goes to sleep. And during the night, he has a dream. And in the dream, an angel comes to him. I don't know if it's the same angel. This angel does not give its name. And the angel says, do not be afraid to marry your intended named Mary, because this baby is going to be a blessing to both of you and to all your people. So he got up and said, okay, we can do this, because he was still in love. He wanted to marry her. And indeed, they brought up their baby, who was Jesus, and he was a blessing to his people. And you know what? He used to teach people a lot. He used to teach people, do not be afraid. And so ends our story. And we're going to sing the children out to their church school with the song on the inside back cover of the gray hymnal.
Good morning. My name is Sally Winkle, and I'm a member of this church, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here in the sanctuary, and to those of you joining us online to worship this morning. In order to reach a wider community than those able to physically be present on Sunday mornings, our services are live streamed on YouTube and Facebook. Joys and Concerns, however, are not live streamed or recorded. And before I continue, could I remind everyone, please do turn off your cell phones. As Unitarian Universalists, our spiritual paths vary, but in this congregation we have made a covenant together. We affirm our interdependence, celebrate our differences, and work for justice. We deepen our relationships as we create a compassionate, welcoming community, nurture spiritual growth, and act on our values in the broader world. I want to extend a special welcome to all visitors worshiping with us this morning. And we ask you to wear the paper name tags because it recognizes you as someone who we would like to meet. If you're seeking a spiritual home, we hope that you might find it here. Whether you are new to Unitarian Universalism or visiting from another UU congregation, we invite you to stop by the welcome table after the service to have any questions answered. People become members of this congregation by signing the membership book and supporting the church with their time and finances. If you are considering joining the church, please talk to our assistant minister, Denise Gouch, after the service. Also after the service, we will be offering coffee and fellowship in the social area, where you will find information about current opportunities for engagement and reflection. There are a number of announcements in the weekly bulletin, which I hope you will take home and read. Thank you.
At this time, I want to invite you to perhaps finish arriving here in this sanctuary. Know yourself part of a beloved gathered community. Take a few deep breaths. Think back over the last few hours, days, maybe the last week of your life or so. And as you do so, you may become aware of profound joys or sorrows, concerns or worries that you'd like to make present here in the sanctuary. If so, you are invited to come forward. Our lay minister, Jean Klein, will help you to place a stone in this bowl of water to mark that joy or concern. If you would like Jean or I to read that to make it known to the community, there are yellow slips of paper in the pew in front of you. If you write legibly, we will do our best to speak your concern or joy to the congregation. Please come and share. holding these concerns and all the others that lie unspoken for now in our hearts, let us join in a spirit of prayer. Spirit of life and love, help us to be mindful in this moment that we are never alone, that our concerns, our celebrations, our joys, and our sorrows are all held in the web of all existence, that we gather in this place to create those ever-important spaces for peace, to learn to create peace in ourselves, among each other, and among the nations. Help us to relax into this time of peace, this time of being together, to know that all that lies within our hearts is held also within this community. Blessed be. Amen. May it be so. At this time, it is our custom to take up an offering for the support of the work of this church. It is also our custom to share a portion of the offerings in the plate each week with another organization in our community that furthers our goals. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but let me note that there are instructions in the order of service for online giving if you want to use a mobile device for that purpose. If you're at home joining us through the wonders of the internet, you're invited to, if you need instructions for donating, to go to our website, thefun, thefun.org, and you'll find directions there. This month, we are sharing our plate with the Tennessee Alliance for Kids. And we are very fortunate this morning to have Janessa Ford, who works for the Tennessee Alliance for Kids, here to tell us a little bit more about their work.
Good morning. Thank you, Reverend Gail and Denise and all of you for letting me get to come and share this morning about our work in our community. And I'm excited because I've already seen on your website that you all are partnering with Davidson County Community Advisory Board, serving the foster care community. And so important. Many of these children don't receive anything for Christmas unless there are amazing partners like this church that can step up and meet that need. And aren't you just so grateful to be a part of a community and a church community that doesn't just see the local problem, but that actually says we're going to be the answer and we're going to take responsibility. And I'm just grateful for your partnership. And so the Tennessee Alliance for Kids, our mission is to engage the community to provide and meet the emergent and ongoing needs of children who are at risk of coming into foster care, those who are in care, and those children that are aging out. And we were founded in 2016 as a response to the state. The head of kinship and adoption and foster care at the time, a man named John Johnson, had asked a group of foster care advocates if we would consider starting this nonprofit to meet these needs because they're endless. And so ultimately the response was yes to that, and I served as a volunteer for the last year and a half and have just come on staff in the last few months. And so I just want to share a few of our impact numbers in those 2 short years that we've been in existence, what we've been able to accomplish with the community's help. And that is that we've received 423 requests from DCS, and so we're basically a liaison between them and the community. So we've received requests for things like beds and car seats and things that are just tangible needs to help these families and children in crisis. And that's represented over 650 children, and it's enabled 136 children to be reunified with their families or to keep them from coming into care at all, less inflicting the trauma that kids coming into foster care go through. And the community impact dollar, by engaging the community to provide these needs, is north of $4 million. And so we've been very productive and busy in our time of existence. And so I just invite you after the service to go to the social justice table to pick up some literature that we brought today. This blue card gives more about the programs that we've put into place to serve this community and some next steps of practical ways to engage with our organization, as well as this giving card that just kind of shares more of the breakdown of what your gift allows our organization to do. So thank you all.
Our reading this morning is taken from a United Nations report entitled, "What Would It Take to Make a Surge in Diplomacy for Peace?" It was released in January of 2017. In contemporary usage, diplomacy refers to all forms of communications, networking, and negotiations in international relations to advance not only the interests of a given state, but ideally also the aspirations of its citizens. Diplomacy seeks to unite states around shared values and interests, and uses norms, mediating processes, and structures to guard against competing interests leading to violence. In the 21st century, the limits of state diplomacy are evident. Because so many drivers of conflict are transnational in origin and effect, and because war and diplomacy are no longer the sole preserve of states, various adaptations to traditional diplomacy have emerged. Multilateral diplomacy for peace constitutes one of these adaptations. Its starting point is not only the formal basis of statehood or sovereignty, but the practical basis of a capacity for peace at both local and international levels. From this perspective, peace involves more than eliminating the threats that endanger it. Peace requires the prevalence of social, political, and economic processes and structures that equitably deliver basic services and create relationships of trust that allow groups and individuals to pursue legitimate needs and aspirations without coercion or fear, with justice and in security. Creating and nurturing structures and institutions that underpin and sustain peaceful societies would be the ultimate aim of diplomacy for peace. In order to be successful in attaining its objectives, diplomacy for peace would include not only traditional tools outlined in the UN Charter, but also processes that put politics, people, and a healthy social contract at the center of peace endeavors. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres implied, any citizen can also be a diplomat. Contemporary history books contain many stories of parallel citizen diplomacy that plots for peace away from public view. From a diplomacy for peace perspective, peace building is a whole of society endeavor. It extends beyond the state or the parties involved in a conflict and flows through all three pillars of the UN's work: security, development, and human rights. Under this framework, building sustainable peace entails not only changing patterns of governance and economic policies, but also transforming relationships, building trust, and restoring the legitimacy of public institutions.
I'd like to invite you to join me in singing number 155, Circle Round for Freedom. Please rise and body your spirit if you're so moved, and join in the singing. Feel free to harmonize as you would be moved. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children. Keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom. Circle round for peace, for all Circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children. Keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom. Circle round for peace. For all of us imprisoned. Circle for release. Circle for the planet. Circle for each soul. For the children of our children. Keep the circle
I'd like to invite you into a few minutes on the spirit of silence. Maybe this song and this story have suggested to you a reflection on where fear has blocked you and your abilities to build trusting, transformative relationships, where fear has kept you reaching out into circles both small and great to circle round for peace. Fear not. Fear not.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about fear lately. I think we are feeling a lot of fear in the nation lately. And I've been thinking about all the articles I've read for years about the diplomatic service in the U.S. and how it seems to be being decimated. And I was curious about the relationship. And so I did do a lot of research to start to figure out if that was true and trying to get an overview of it. And I'm going to start this morning by referring to the story I told from the Christian Bible. In the Protestant Bible, there's 80 books. Each canon, each religion has a different canon. So in the Protestants, they have 80 books. And in those books, the words fear not or do not be afraid show up 110 times. Now, you don't have to take the Bible literally or as your sole guide to religion to notice that there's a theme there, and consider whether it's a spiritual theme. Why do people from different cultures and different times think about when we need to be afraid and when not to be afraid? It's a spiritual discernment that people of many times and places have had to consider. I mean, fear is a really good thing. Hey, from that gun, whatever it is. And at the same time, we're social beings, like poor Joseph there, who was fearing something that was not life or death. It might have been once. I mean, we're hardwired to fear exile, where you get kicked out of the community, you could die. But it doesn't work a lot of times to be reactive with fear. It makes things worse. We might do something that is not part of our ethical and moral code, and we might do something that keeps us from being connected and loving. And so taking that deep breath, having a moment to reflect with fear, that fear not, can help us rather to react, to choose how to act. And that's part of all of our ethical or spiritual discernment. Now, in the story about Joseph, it's contrasted, this part where he's saying fear not, of this social shame that could be put on you, with another story that he is supposed to be afraid and react, and he does. And we don't tell the story as much about after the you know the story about how the three kings come to find the king of the Jews. And they go to Herod, King Herod, who is a Jewish king, but he is the puppet or, works for the Roman Empire. And so when he hears that there's a king of the Jews, he thinks rebellion. And, he knows it's job to keep his country down for the Romans. And so he tells the three kings to come back and tell him where this king is, this new king is. And they have a dream, a lot of dreams in the book of Matthew. We do, maybe it's because another thing, we all do a lot of spiritual discernment in our dreams. And the wise men dreamed that they should not go back to Herod, that would be dangerous for this baby that they found. At the same time, Joseph has a dream. And in this dream, the angel tells, and by doing that, he saves their life, according to the story. Because Herod, who's so angry that he doesn't know where this future king that could start a rebellion is, makes a proclamation for the army to kill all male children under 2 in that area, in the area of Bethlehem, where he knew the kings were going. And that's called the slaughter of the innocents. It's not the most cheerful story to think about at Christmas time. But when I went to Bethlehem, which is behind the wall, right at the edge of Israel in the Palestinian territory, where of course, it's still a region of great fear for different reasons. In Bethlehem, there's this huge Byzantine church called the Church of the Nativity. And you go in, Byzantine, it has all kinds of fancy stuff. But then you go down these stairs into this very deep cellar. And in the cellar are all these little areas of dirt that are roped off. And one of them's supposed to be where the stable was, where Jesus was born. It's right there. And people touch it. It's worn down, many people very devotionally touch it for blessing. And as you go deeper and deeper into these kind of rooms and then caves, there's one cave that's kind of up at eye level, and it goes deep in. It's kind of a crevice in the earth, and it's called the Crypt of the Innocents. And they are where all those babies, those toddlers and babies, were supposed to be buried during this massacre. So, here we have this contrast of fear not, and yes, you better be afraid, and you better react, and the importance of being able to discern the difference. Well, in our world, we have two things that help us discern the difference when it comes to looking at peace in the nations, peace in the world. And that's a whole tradition of diplomacy, and we have, on the other hand, the military. And over the years, there have been times when the diplomatic corps or the foreign service have been balanced with the military, balanced in authority and balanced in able to work with one another to create peace as much as possible. And there have been times when the military has been given more authority and gets to call the shots, and fear overcomes the diplomatic corps. They get reduced. And I was really curious if that was happening now. And so when we were looking, so I'm going to start with the toolbox of diplomacy and just talk a little about diplomacy and then look at what's happening in the U.S. today. In the United Nations, they talk about having a toolbox of diplomacy. So I've been thinking about it as a set of tools. And in my household, the tools that get used a lot stay nice and shiny. We sharpen up the things that are supposed to be sharp and keep things clean and ready to work on. And the tools we don't use, quite honestly, get dull and rusty. Sometimes we lose them. And so in this toolbox that we're imagining for diplomacy are two basic tools that are very simple. They're all things that we all do every day. One is conversation. Conversation. Now, it's certain kinds of conversation, face-to-face conversation with actual people. And the other tool is persuasion. Now, for these tools to work, working for peace, there are certain skills that that people learn to make them effective tools for diplomacy. So conversation. Let's face it, when we need diplomacy, it's when people have a difference of agreement or they see the world differently, and it often brings up what a lot of us think of as unpleasant feelings, like fear or confusion or whatever, but we'll just stick with fear today because that's our theme. And so somebody has to be in a conversation, know how they're going to handle their feelings, those unpleasant feelings especially. So they have to know how to take a deep breath and be fully present and ascertain, discern whether this is something, what I'm going to do with these feelings and choose. Okay, so that's one skill that's important in this conversation. Now, usually when we have diplomacy, people of different, especially world diplomacy, different backgrounds, different beliefs, different histories, different points of view. And so these conversations have a lot of listening. And it's a kind of listening where you're really listening for understanding first. In other words, you're trying to understand a different point of view. Okay? Listening for understanding. And then you're also listening to each other for common interests. So you know there's differences, but you also go in to listen for common interests. Everything I read about world diplomacy is this works best when people have been so good at building these relationships over time that they have long-term relationships that have built trust. In other words, diplomacy isn't something most of the time in very difficult world things that happen overnight. It takes a lot of trust building. If you have that trust building, that relationship with people with different points of view, then you have the ability to use persuasion to find points of shared interests and to get to that. Now, there's, again, many skills that people learn to persuade others. I mean, sometimes the skill is being creative and finding a way that nobody thought about how to act and move forward. Sometimes it's a compromise, and it's a skill to compromise. Sometimes it's holding out the carrot. It's saying, oh, well, we'll give this to you that you need, right? And we'll help you out in this way. And sometimes it's the stick, and that's why you need the military. You do need to be able to set limits and say we can't go beyond this, and if it comes to policing or the military, we'll have to do that. Sanctions in the world right now is the most common way that we do that, economic sanctions, but the military is a very useful part of the diplomatic skill set. So I kind of thought that American diplomacy started going south. I shouldn't say that because I'm in the South. I love being here. The skill set started to dissolve and not be as honored after 9/11, when people got really afraid, right? There's a lot of fear. And it is true. Since that time, the military has been given more and more money and authority. But before I go into that more, I just want to say it didn't start then. It had already started. It had started in the 1990s, this kind of trend, and it was after the Cold War was done. So people felt like, oh, we don't need as much diplomacy, so let's cut back on diplomacy now that the Cold War is done. So before the height of the diplomatic corps that went really from World War II, where it was very built up, through the Cold War, that was the height. And then in the 1990s, it was funded and staffed about 20% less. So that happened before the 9/11. 9/11, people understood that by having fewer diplomats, they were kind of in trouble. They didn't really have as many diplomats as they thought they needed in that part of Asia and in the Middle East. And so they wanted to build it up, but they did not build it up in the State Department, where the diplomats and the foreign services are come out of. They built it up in the military. They started building up giving the military authority to do the state building, building the infrastructure, the kinds of things that Denise was reading about that help make a nation more stable and less able to, feeling like they need to fight to survive. Over the years, I want to give an example of how this affected how we deal with diplomacy and war. During the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, as they're giving the generals more authority to doing the diplomacy, we had diplomats there. Now, what the diplomats there would do was they would try to create, the career diplomats, a large strategy for the area. And so they would be talking and building long-term relationships for this goal of what do we need to have peace in this area in 10 years, right? And they knew that we had to talk to everybody, right? So, for instance, Richard Holbrooke wanted to talk to the Taliban. And the military said, no, you can't. Richard Holbrooke was in charge of, at that point, the diplomats in that area, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And he's the one that brokered the peace deals in Bosnia, okay? So he wanted to, and the military said, no, you can't. You cannot talk to the Taliban. So in diplomacy, it's like, it doesn't matter if they're the bad guys. We're used to talking to the bad guys. The whole point is to talk to the bad guys. We might not get anywhere, but you got to keep those communication channels open. The military said, no, we've already working with these warlords over there. They don't want us to talk to them. In other words, they building relationships with only military people, not with civilians. And so it became unbalanced. There were some actual negotiations, which I did not know until I read this book, The War on Peace, The End of Diplomacy by Ronan Farrow, who was in the diplomatic corps at that time. So he has his point of view. He has his complaints that he wants to express. But he also has become a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter on diplomacy throughout the world. So was very interesting. And he told about this time, people in Pakistan brokered with people in the Taliban and Germany to sneak off to Germany and start negotiating with the Taliban. And, best case, if he'd been allowed to continue those diplomatic things, best case is they could have ended the war more than 10 years ago in Afghanistan. The military didn't want that to happen. Worst case, no progress was made, but they still had connections, and boy, we could use those connections still if the war had continued. So the worst story, besides the fact that people just kept getting laid off, especially the most experienced people over the years, since 2001, so that now there's people with very little long-term experience. The worst thing was, the story that got me the most was about this woman, and I wrote her name down because for some reason it's Robin Raquel. And Robin Raquel was in the diplomatic corps in Pakistan for 40 years. Now, Pakistan is a very difficult country to keep diplomatic relations with because they say one thing and they do another thing, and it's pretty consistent, and they're mad at anybody who ever talks to India, and we talk to India all the time. But she went to school there, she went to college there, she married someone in the diplomatic corps who was later killed in an airplane crash on a mission there. And she was just a classic, what now they call old school diplomat. So she talked to people. She knew people for 40 years, and she went to parties. That's where she talked to people. Parties, lunch. And she knew everybody. She's the one that knew the people in the Taliban. She's the one that knew everybody. And she knew them for 40 years, and they trusted her. Okay? Well, what was happening in the U.S. in terms of aid with the military to figure out who was serving us well and who was not? And a lot of you understand this a lot better about how they started, they monitor, and you know this, they monitor all of the emails and phone calls and everything, and they don't listen to each one, but they do the logarithms of how, what words come up the most. And so, all right, so here she is. She's a diplomat, and in her communications, they don't know it's her first, come up a lot of words like Afghanistan, Taliban, drones, war, and she gets targeted. She doesn't know she's targeted. She just knows that the CIA comes one day and arrests her for being a spy after 40 years of working for the State Department. She's still working there. They arrest her as a spy. Now, as soon as it became open and they started talking to people, they found out she was not a spy, but she had to go to court. So she's like now 65 years old. She can't get a job, and she owes $100,000, even though she was found not guilty. Many diplomats say this was the end of diplomacy in America because they actually use these words. Diplomacy is now against the law. We actually aren't allowed to talk to people about these sensitive issues. So, yes, it got even worse in our previous administration. Much worse, because all of the training programs and recruitment programs for the State Department have been just cut. So there's nobody new coming in and only people leaving. So it's not, and we all know, it's not being, people who theoretically jobs that should be there are not being filled. So I got really depressed reading this book. Quite honestly, I got really depressed. But reading this stuff from the United Nations helped cheer me up a little. Because they started talking, in the United Nations, they talk about, yes, it is difficult right now to do diplomacy nation to nation. And people are depending on the military. But we all, so many of us, have relationships, real working relationships with people around the world. And those relationships build those ongoing conversations of trust, even in difficult places. Now, I, for instance, was talking to my son this morning. I called him by accident, but he was in India, so it was 6 o'clock here in the morning, but it was 6 o'clock. He was just going to dinner. He's working there. So, yes, he works for a big corporation. It's probably got its problems, but the reason they keep sending him back there is because he knows how to do face-to-face conversation, have difficult conversations. He is a diplomat. There are people in this room that I know for jobs and for work have been for volunteer work, for education, for medical things, have been in the most difficult parts of the world building relationships. And it is those relationships that give me hope. But if we think about what Lao Tzu, the Taoist, taught thousands of years ago, not thousands, but it's 1,000 years ago, that there's peace, to be peace in the world, to be peace in the nations, to be peace in the city, to be peace in the neighborhood and in your home and in your heart. And if we think about what the United Nations says about we all can learn to be citizen diplomats, right? citizen diplomats. My invitation to myself and to all of you is to learn to discern what you do in your heart and in your gut with difficult feelings, with conflict, with fear, and to stay into conversation. To stay into conversation. Learn those skills of what it means to listen to the other. Find common self-interests. Because we need to keep those skills polished up and sharpened. We need them in the world. Fear not. Fear not. May it be so.
Please rise in body or in spirit as you're so moved and join in singing number 1017 in the turquoise hymnal. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, number 1017. We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, making it stronger every day. We are building a new way. We're working to be free. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. We are working to be free of hate and greed and jealousy. We are working to be free. We can feed our every need. Feed our every need. We can feed our every need. We can feed our every need. Start with love that is the seed. We can feed our every need. Peace and freedom. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Without these we'll surely die. Peace and freedom is our cry.
Please join me in reciting the words for the chalice of extinguishing as found in your program. We extinguish
This flame, but not the flame of the warmth of community or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. May the love which overcomes all differences, which heals all wounds, which puts to flight all fears, which reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us, now and always. The service is over. Let our service begin again, renewed.